Step back into Hollywood's golden age where the silver screen glittered and every film promised magic. Behind the curtains of those classic movies, however, some of the brightest stars fought silent battles the tabloids never printed. Tonight, we unmask 20 legends of vintage cinema whose on-set smiles hid unspoken pain, from crippling anxiety to despair no studio executive dared mention. Their stories reveal how fame can magnify darkness even as cameras still flash. Keep watching because the truth behind the glamour may change the way you watch old movies forever. Bette Davis strode through Hollywood's golden age like a general in heels, commanding every set she entered. Yet outside the Klieg lights of vintage cinema, she wrestled with rolling storms of depression as fierce as her on-screen glare. Studio chiefs praised her stamina, never seeing the trembling hands hidden behind a cigarette when panic crashed like a rogue wave. Every new film required a smile. Nights alone, insomnia whispered that tomorrow her legendary voice might crack. Friends remembered her pacing hotel corridors, rehearsing dialogue simply to outrun the noise inside her head. Some evenings she downed martinis like others sipped tea, hoping the burn would numb anxiety before dawn. Critics later hailed those classic movies for volcanic emotion, unaware the lava flowed straight from her private torment. To a trusted confidant, she admitted applause felt hollow once curtains fell because silence made the depression roar. The audience never suspected. She pressed on, sharpening each roll until metal shrieked against stone. Her charisma is only the opening act. Wait until you meet our next star, whose smile hid an even darker secret. James Dean was the embodiment of restless youth, but behind the rebel leather he carried a loneliness that could swallow a highway at night. As cameras rolled on East of Eden, publicity agents packaged him as raw vitality incarnate. Yet when the floodlights dimmed, depression seeped in like exhaust through a cracked window. He prowled Los Angeles at 3 a.m., pushing his Porsche faster than his thoughts because motion felt safer than stillness. Classmates at the actor's studio whispered that the brooding charge critics praised was a real storm he could barely leash. Between takes, he scribbled poems questioning why Hollywood demanded perpetual cool, fearing sudden fame was only a trapdoor. On the set of his final film, he joked about quitting the business to raise pigs in Indiana, projecting old vintage movies against a barn wall where no one screamed his name. The tragedy remains that the icon who electrified classic cinema never learned to play a quieter role for himself, and his clock ran out before the credits could roll. Rita Hayworth glided across Hollywood sound stages like liquid fire, her crimson hair catching every spotlight in that golden era of glamour. Audiences lost breath watching her twirl in classic cinema gems like Gilda, never guessing the forgetting had already begun. Mid-take, she'd drift, eyes flickering as lines vanished. Directors blamed nerves, but the first embers of early-onset Alzheimer's were quietly burning. Friends noticed she asked the same question twice, laughing it off before pouring another drink. Off-camera, she stuffed scripts into purses, rereading them in taxis so no one would see the gaps. The disease eroded confidence, and depression crept in to fill the cracks. At night, she replayed old movies on her projector, studying her own face to remember who the audience said she was. Doctors in the 1950s medicine shrugged, calling it stress of show business. By the time the diagnosis arrived decades later, the screen goddess had become a fragile figure, tracing memories like fingerprints on fogged glass. A haunting reminder that the reels of vintage film sometimes hide scenes no spotlight can illuminate. Montgomery Clift was the tender heart of vintage Hollywood, a soft-spoken counterpoint to the booming stars that dominated the golden era cinema marquee. Then one midnight curve on Sunset Boulevard shattered both his profile and his peace. Surgeons wired his jaw, but they could not fuse the splinters of confidence left behind. Pills stole sleep, bourbon blurred mirrors. Every new film demanded the old perfection, and the strain carved deeper hollows beneath his eyes. On the set of the classic movie Raintree County, whispers spread that he rehearsed lines only to forget them minutes later, lost in foggy dread. He hid behind dark glasses, claiming allergies while panic gnawed his pulse. Directors praised his raw realism, never realizing pain was the method. Friends recall him studying earlier movies, searching for the fearless boy who walked into auditions laughing. Instead, he found fragments, like a reel scorched by projector heat. Had today's therapy existed, perhaps his story would read differently. Stay close, because the next legend's struggle with fame shows how quickly applause can flip to accusation. As you watch these powerful stories unfold, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Which star's hidden struggle surprised you the most? Drop a comment below and don't forget to subscribe for more Untold Hollywood stories. Grace Kelly stepped out of the Paramount gates like a swan and into Monaco's palace like a myth come alive. Yet beneath the diamond tiara, she ferried a constant thrum of anxiety that never made the gossip columns. The transition from Hollywood soundstage to royal balcony magnified every camera flash, and sleepless nights multiplied. Protocol lessons felt harsher than any director's notes. A missed curtsy could spark scandal. During the Golden Age, she dazzled classic movies like Rear Window, but the unblinking court kept its own script. She rehearsed speeches alone, voice catching whenever she imagined mispronouncing a dignitary's title. Doctors prescribed sedatives. She hid them in embroidered clutch bags. While the Riviera applauded its American princess, she confided to Hitchcock, "I'm terrified they'll find out I'm ordinary." Watching her early film reels in a palace screening room, she clutched pearls tighter each time the projector hummed, longing for the controlled chaos of vintage cinema sets. Perfection became armor, yet the weight of steel lace left bruises only mirrors could see. She smiled, bowed, and kept breathing through the applause. Howard Hughes towered over Hollywood, a lanky tycoon whose airplanes sliced clouds while his mind ground in obsessive loops. In the heady Golden Age, he produced audacious films like Hell's Angels, but behind the clatter of propellers, another engine. The compulsive counting, the germ terror, never shut down. Guests entering his screening room faced interrogations about hand washing. Hughes recorded their answers on index cards no one else ever saw. As classic cinema matured, he retreated to dark hotel suites, wrapping phone receivers in tissue and storing his urine in labeled jars, convinced outside microbes stalked him. Executives waited weeks for signatures while he rewrote contracts line by line, afraid a misplaced comma would doom the picture. On vintage newsreels, he appears rakish, yet hotel staff reported a gaunt figure pacing barefoot across newspaper-lined carpets, muttering calculations about plane wing rivets. Painkillers soothed chronic crashes from earlier test flights, and addiction twined with ritual until daylight itself felt toxic. In the end, the billionaire aviator became a ghost inside velvet curtains, projecting movies only he could watch, forever chasing flawless liftoff into perfection. Gene Tierney's porcelain beauty lit classic Hollywood like a china lamp, yet after giving birth to a deaf-blind daughter infected with rubella, guilt wrapped around her throat like slow ivy. In the shimmering golden era, audiences admired her icy poise in film noir masterpiece Laura. Unaware she sobbed between takes, convinced her career stole her child's health. Depression soon partnered with manic surges. She'd shop Fifth Avenue at dawn, then refused to leave bed for days. Studios labeled it exhaustion and scheduled secret hospital stays where electroshock therapy stole fragments of memory she needed for lines. Neighbors glimpsed her wandering Central Park, counting steps as if each might erase blame. Returning to cinema, she feared forgetting dialogue live on set. Cue cards multiplied like silent judges. Cocktail parties showed a radiant smile, but inside she replayed vintage movies of what-ifs, editing alternate endings no editor could cut. Finally, she vanished into rural Texas, tending horses for serenity doctors couldn't prescribe. Her story reminds us the harshest spotlight often shines inward, illuminating shadows money and fame can't dim for long. Clara Bow burst through silent Hollywood like a firecracker, the original It Girl whose grin turned ticket lines into stampedes. Yet in the very golden era cinema she defined, her childhood ghost clung tight. Raised in Brooklyn tenements by a mother battling psychosis, Clara learned early that applause couldn't drown screaming memories. Studio bosses pushed her to crank out 5 films a year. Between setups, she hyperventilated, convinced cameras were X-rays revealing every flaw. Rumors of wild parties masked nights where she curled under dressing room tables, sobbing that success felt like theft from the hungry girl she'd been. Gossip rags jeered broken morals, never noting the undiagnosed anxiety fraying her nerves like old nitrate. When talkies arrived, she feared her thick accent would sink her. Early test reels sounded alien to ears accustomed to silence. Rather than face ridicule, she bolted. trading Klieg lights for desert ranches and repairing radios just to keep hands busy. Today, her vintage movies play like effervescent dreams, but behind each frame lies a woman who finally chose quiet over cameras. Stay tuned. The next Legends jewels couldn't shield her from mood-storm tempests. Diamonds reflected flashbulbs whenever Elizabeth Taylor stepped into classic Hollywood, yet no gem could refract the mood swings rumbling beneath those violet eyes. Child stardom welded her to the studio system. By 23, she'd filmed tragedies grander than most lives. Between marriages, even during the opulent film Cleopatra, she oscillated from euphoric shopping sprees to days immobilized by depression so dense she described it as wearing a lead cape. Surgeons mended her spine, trachea, and heart. Pills handled the rest, multiplying until doctors tallied 70 a day. Tabloids feasted on her romances, but ignored the panic attacks that sent her fleeing premieres minutes before curtains rose, breathless among sequined gowns. She once confessed that applause sounded distant, like the ocean in a conch shell, whenever melancholia thickened. Rehab stays became as routine as costume fittings, yet she returned each time, riveting audiences in golden-era movies that blurred art and autobiography. In later years, she fought back, transforming pain into AIDS advocacy firepower. Still, watch her vintage cinema close-ups. Every glint of glamour flickers beside shadows fame could never fully light. From Hoboken bars to Rat Pack legend, Frank Sinatra crooned an effortless cool that seemed to float atop Hollywood's classic movies and Vegas neon. Yet the chairman's swagger often disguised panic that ambushed him like lousy acoustics. Early critics called him washed up after Bobby Soxer mania faded. He spent nights pacing hotel floors, convinced failure lurked in tomorrow's reviews. During the film shoot of From Here to Eternity, friends found him in the alley behind the studio, palms bleeding from punching brick. Proof anxiety could outshout even his famous pipes. He'd vanish mid-set, hiding in dressing room closets until heartbeats slowed. Rumors of attempted self-harm swirled whenever romances imploded. He deflected with jokes about whiskey and dames. Doctors whispered about exhaustion, prescribing tranquilizers he mixed with bourbon in tall glasses. On stage, spotlights framed a titan of Golden Age cinema, voice fluttering effortlessly through Fly Me to the Moon. Off stage, he telephoned friends at 3 a.m., begging them to confirm he still mattered. His music remains timeless vintage elegance, but the taped-down tux cuffs hid wrists that trembled more than any microphone stand. Next, discover how another icon's laughter cloaked a different brand of inner turmoil. Marilyn Monroe glittered like a living postcard for vintage Hollywood, the dream every marquee promised in that golden age. But when the orchestra packed up and studio gates clanged shut, she faced a silence thick enough to choke. Childhood trauma shadowed her fame. Night after night, insomnia perched on the bedpost, daring her to sleep without pills. Barbiturates became script pages. She read them until consciousness faded. Crew on her last film remembered her staring at light stands as if searching for forgiveness, forgetting lines she'd rehearsed hours earlier. Studios blamed lateness, masking the depression thickening beneath perfume. She phoned friends at dawn, asking if love could be borrowed like sugar. Psychiatrists prescribed rest. Tabloids printed rumors instead. In interviews, she smiled, saying she loved the movies, yet her diary posed darker questions no columnist would run. The star who made classic cinema sparkle could not find a camera angle that erased her doubt. When the world lost Norma Jean, it also lost proof that glamour alone can't quiet haunted dreams. Judy Garland's voice could lift a theater roof, yet the same lungs fought to breathe beneath MGM's iron timetable. At 14, studio doctors slid amphetamines across the makeup table, promising pep for those dance numbers that powered classic cinema. The pills rocketed her through 3-day shoots. Barbiturates crash-landed her at night. Years later, she joked that her life felt like continuous opening night inside a broken clock. Between takes on A Star is Born, she paced the soundstage, reciting lines twice to be sure memory hadn't vanished. Friends recall hotel room curtains taped shut while mania scribbled song lyrics on stationery already covered with apologies. Depression followed, heavy as scenery walls. She loved movies, but feared audiences would hear the tremor behind each note. Doctors suggested rest. Accountants demanded another film. By 47, she was performing London nightclubs for cab fare, voice still radiant yet eyes flooding under spotlight heat. Even in Golden Age Hollywood, applause could morph into a metronome that hammers until the heart skips tempo forever. Gary Cooper personified the laconic hero of Golden Era cinema, so convincing that audiences as summed silence equaled serenity. Off-screen, however, the strong, silent type wrestled panic attacks that buckled his 6'3" frame like canvas chairs after rap. During a desert shoot, he abandoned a saloon set mid-take, wandering dunes until moonrise cooled a heart-racing nowhere. Doctors labeled it nervous stomach, prescribing milk, fishing trips, and no questions. Still, dread tagged along to every new film, lurking behind clapboards and sun hats. In hotel rooms, he practiced stoic one-liners, hoping rehearsal might anchor breath. Friends noticed he carried antacid tablets as others carried cigarettes. When Hollywood trumpeted him into war bond tours, cold sweat soaked uniform collars moments before speeches. Yet on screen, his steadiness calmed millions attending wartime movies in blackout cities. The price remained invisible. Nights staring at ceilings, counting fan blades like rosary beads. Cooper's legend reminds us that heroic myths can hide fragile wiring, and that even vintage toughness sometimes needs a voice it was never taught to use. Ingrid Bergman sailed into Hollywood glory with luminous grace, yet gathering storms followed her across oceans. Early fame felt like sunrise. Eventually, the glare scorched. After her explosive affair with Roberto Rossellini, scandal sheets across vintage America hurled moral verdicts, and the Academy that once crowned her suddenly shunned her. Isolation bred depression, insomnia marched in step. On European sets, she hid trembling hands behind script pages, afraid the camera would capture the doubt swelling behind those eyes. Between scenes, she wandered hotel corridors, counting crucifixes on wallpaper, praying the public's fury would fade before the next film premiered. She confessed to a friend that applause now sounded like distant thunder I cannot outrun. Critics later praised her return in the classic cinema Anastasia, unaware she swallowed tranquilizers to steady breath during every take. The heroine of the Golden Era shone, but each ovation pierced her heart each uncertain morning. Bergman proved resilience can share a stage with tenderness even when the movies demand perfection. Carrie Fisher arrived decades after Hollywood's Golden Era, but inherited its silence around struggle. So her bipolar highs and lows played out on sets lit by newer technology, yet guided by vintage expectations. On the first Star Wars film, she joked through 4 a.m. call times, masking manic energy that ricocheted harder than blaster bolts. Sleepless nights bled into rewrites. She typed dialogue on hotel stationery while depressive fog whispered the galaxy would forget her. Studio doctors offered diet pills, later antidepressants. She countered with wit, calling herself a mood swing in a metal bikini. During classic cinema retrospectives, fans saw only Leia's courage, not the woman backstage timing medication to panel schedules. She once woke on an airplane believing turbulence came from inside her head. Rehab stints became punctuation between movies, yet Fisher returned, publishing brutally funny memoirs that sliced stigma like a lightsaber. By turning private chaos into art, she proved even in glittering film universes, authenticity can be the bravest rebellion ever. Lana Turner embodied Hollywood's golden age glamour, but the 1958 stabbing of her lover Johnny Stompanato inside her Beverly Hills home detonated an anxiety she could never bury. Press cameras swarmed the courthouse where her teenage daughter testified, and every flash branded Turner's retina with guilt that outshone studio spotlights. Afterward, she floated through classic roles like a porcelain ornament, flawless yet hollow, secretly clutching rosary beads between takes. In dressing rooms, she rehearsed lines a dozen times, terrified a tremor would betray the panic racing beneath satin gowns. Nightclubs broadcast her laughter, but chauffeurs later drove a silent passenger staring at sidewalks as if threats hid in every shadow. Doctors prescribed nerve pills. She washed them down with bourbon disguised as iced tea. She adored the movies, yet feared audience whispers about scandal more than any critic. Turner's tale shows how the vintage film dream machine could amplify trauma, turning soundstage echo into a chorus that followed its stars long after the final cut. Vivien Leigh blazed across Hollywood's golden age with a magnetism that made classic cinema audiences believe Scarlett's stubborn fire and Blanche Dubois' fragile poetry were born only for her. Yet offstage, she pinballed between manic exhilaration and cavernous despair. During a rehearsal high, she conquered entire Shakespeare acts without glancing at a script, ideas spilling faster than stagehands could set props. Then the pendulum swung. In hotel rooms, she lay silent for days, staring at ceiling stains while depression smothered appetite and memory alike. Doctors whispered nervous exhaustion, suggesting rest cures on Mediterranean yachts, but sunlight could not outshine inner eclipse. Friends recalled her clutching costume beads as talismans, praying each performance would end before the darkness surged mid-scene. She loved the movies, yet feared celluloid preserved every tremor forever. Watching her own vintage film loops, she sometimes asked, "Who is that woman?" Vivien Leigh's brilliance proved that raw emotion can birth unforgettable art, even while quietly exacting a price no spotlight reveals. Smooth baritone drifting from radios made Bing Crosby the comforting voice of vintage Hollywood. Yet under the relaxed swing lay a chronic melancholy that even hit records couldn't drown. In the bright bustle of golden-era cinema, he filmed comedies with effortless charm, then retreated to dark dressing rooms where migraines pounded like out-of-sync timpani. Childhood lessons in strict discipline left him forever equating love with perfection. A missed note triggered hours of self-reproach. Touring soldiers' camps during World War II, he strolled on stage smiling but ended sets wiping anxious sweat beneath the brim of that trademark hat. Family remembered nights when he paced hallways, humming White Christmas softly as if rehearsing calm. Doctors called it the blues, prescribing golf and early bedtime, yet insomnia chipped rhythm into every dawn. Audiences still queue for his classic movies, never hearing the backstage metronome of doubt. Crosby's legacy reminds us even the gentlest lullaby in film history can originate from a heart searching for its own quiet refuge. Tyrone Power carved a heroic silhouette across golden-era Hollywood, his sword flashing through vintage swashbucklers while smiles filled balcony seats. Offstage, doubts cut sharper than any prop blade. He confided that each new film felt like gambling with loaded dice. One misstep and reputation might vanish. Restless nights found him roaming Madrid rooftops during location shoots, rehearsing lines into the wind because silence triggered racing thoughts. Producers praised his calm, unaware he gripped rosary beads inside jacket pockets to slow a heart that drummed double time. Back in Los Angeles, he cycled between euphoric party host and withdrawn recluse, burying fears under rigorous weightlifting routines. On November 15, 1958, during a duel scene for a classic CinemaScope epic, he collapsed before cameras, the hidden strain finally snapping. Newspapers blamed overwork. Friends suspected the long, unnamed mood disorder that stalked him since studio school days. His final close-up became a cautionary frame. Even the brightest movies cannot spot the cracks forming behind the grin and haunts film history. Joan Crawford built herself from dust into Hollywood royalty, polishing every gesture until it gleamed beneath vintage arc lights. Perfection, however, was both armor and prison. Childhood poverty left a voice inside her hissing that failure waited around every studio corner. She arrived 2 hours early to each set, rehearsing classic dialogue alone on dark stages while scrubbing fingerprints from props. Cast members noticed knuckles raw from obsessive cleaning. She joked the glitter had allergies. When cameras rolled, she radiated commanding poise, but between takes, anxiety compressed her lungs until a makeup artist fanned her with call sheets. Headlines later obsessed over parenting scandals, yet friends remembered nights she paced swimming pool edges, counting steps to mute intrusive memories. Vodka straight from a Duar's bottle soothed nerves, though mornings dawned with sterner self-audits. In the twilight of Golden Age cinema, she watched her own movies obsessively, grading each eyebrow arch. The screen idol who demanded flawless takes never found a director able to shout "cut" on self-doubt.